University as a first-generation college student with a bachelor's in social work and international studies. After graduating, she moved to the Federated States of Micronesia to teach high school for 2 years. In 2013, she completed her master's in social work at Columbia University in New York City with an emphasis in social policy. During her studies in New York, she worked with the Voices of Women Organizing Project, a community organizing nonprofit working with survivors of domestic violence. After 6 months in Central America during college and various trips back to the region, as well as time along the US-Mexico border, Jessica has a passion for immigration policy. Jessica, welcome. And just to give you a sense of the flow of this evening, Jessica is going to introduce our other two panelists after she talks a little bit more about her own work at SLU. And we will have time for questions and answers from the audience in about 30 minutes or so. Please feel free to drop those questions into the Q&A function at any time so we can deliver those to the panelists later in the webinar. All right, Jessica, thank you.
All right, thank you, Rachel. So as Dr. Lindsay said, my name is Jessica Trout, and I work here at St. Louis University in the Center for Social Action. We just changed our name 2 weeks ago. And I am the advocacy coordinator there. So upon coming to SLU, I jumped into kind of generalist policy and advocacy work, but my passion has always been immigration. And so I was fortunate enough to be able to kind of lean into that work. So some of the things that we do in the Center for Social Action, if you want to get involved, include policy pods, small groups of students that will work on specific issues, but specifically we have an immigration policy pod, and we actually usually follow IFLA and Kino's work to kind of figure out where we're going to focus that, that pod and that policy. We also will do things like call-in days on immigration, again, following our partners in the Center for Social Action. That's my dog. He just came home today. But then one of the things that's actually coming up, which connects so well to this presentation, is that we are advertising right now for a spring break trip to Kino, to Nogales, Arizona. And with that, it's not just the trip. We do about 6 weeks of learning prior to the trip, and then we come back and we continue our meetings and we continue talking about what ways can we take action and be more in solidarity with our own St. Louis community and with those at the border. So that will be coming up. We've also done things like working with Oasis and bringing in Hostel Train 94, things like that. So I don't want to take up too much time with what we do because I think you're really here to hear from two wonderful organizations that I have been honored to work with since I have been at SLU. So I'm really just going to introduce Pedro and Sara and let them take over. Actually, we'll introduce Sara for, oh, nope, I'm starting with Pedro. So I will introduce both of them now, and then after Pedro speaks, just let him pass it off to Sara, and then we'll come back for some Q&A. So like I said, Pedro works with Kino Border Initiative, and a little bit about him. He is a lawyer from Mexico with more than 12 years of experience working with migrant communities on both sides of the border between Mexico and the United States. He currently serves as the Director of Advocacy and Education at Kino Border Initiative, a binational organization that provides humanitarian assistance to migrants in Nogales, Sonora. Pedro was the state coordinator of the Paisanos program in I practiced this, in Coahuila, Mexico, a program responsible for supporting and informing Mexicans and Mexican Americans about their rights and obligations upon returning or visiting Mexico. He moved to Tucson in 2013 to work with migrants and the immigrant community in Southern Arizona at the Consulate of Mexico in Tucson, where he was the head of consular protection and legal affairs. His role was to protect the rights and well-being of Mexican nationals abroad, which allowed him to know firsthand their needs and challenges. Pedro worked in benefit of our community, regardless of national origin or background, which led him to becoming a community organizer with Chicanos por la Causa, responsible for promoting immigrant integration and integral community development in Southern Arizona. So Pedro, welcome. As I said, I'm gonna introduce Sara as well, but since you can't see the round of applause, we're doing it now. And Sara John is the executive director of IFLA and became the executive director after being the board president. She joined IFLA in the summer of 2016 and has been with them for 15 years since she was a student at St. Louis University, where she received her bachelor's degree in Spanish and International Studies. She also studied at the University of Arizona in Tucson, where she earned a master's in arts in Latin American studies with an emphasis on the US-Mexico border. Sara's graduate research centered on migrants that disappear on their journey to the United States. She has lived and traveled throughout southern Mexico. Sara has extensive professional background working for migration justice and speaks fluent Spanish. Frequently, her 6-year-old son, Alexander, participates in IFLA activities as one of the youngest activists. So welcome, Sara. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Pedro for his remarks.
Thank you very much for that introduction and for allowing me to be here with you all today. So as mentioned, I've dedicated most of my professional life to working with migrants, but I'm a migrant myself. I'm from Mexico, from Saltillo, Coahuila, and basically I love the opportunity to be able to work with a Kino Border Initiative. So most of you might be aware of the existence of Kino, but those of you who aren't, we are a binational organization, and when we say binational, we are talking about our presence in both the United States and Mexico. So we have an outreach and research center for migrants in Nogales, Sonora, where we are able to provide direct humanitarian assistance to migrants who are arriving to the border, even like if they're seeking to present an asylum claim at the port of entry, or if they've been recently deported or expelled from the United States. So we receive them, we're able to provide food, shelter, psychological assistance, legal services. We have also different resources to connect them with, but it's also about this approach of working with them to facilitate their integration into the community. And we also are present in the United States, and that's the kind of the advocacy and education portion of our work. So a lot of the job that we do at Kino Border Initiative is not only about this direct humanitarian assistance, but helping people understand the reality of the border. And that's why we keep inviting different authorities and congressional offices and other agents that, decision makers, to come to the border and understand the reality. Because once you come here and you understand the impact of the policies and the decisions that are being taken up in Washington or inside the United States and how they repercute to the lives of migrants on the other side of the border, there is no way that you can go back to where you were. This understanding about the consequences of these policies change the whole perspective. So a lot of the efforts that we do is about helping people understand the complexities, but also, trying to help make this distinction. It's about stop seeing immigration as a problem that needs to be solved or contained, and rather understand that mobility is natural to human beings, and that we need to learn to, treat our brothers and sisters with empathy. They deserve to be welcome, respected, and loved. And so a lot of our advocacy efforts, it's about explaining how the ongoing policies are affecting the lives of the migrants waiting on the other side of the border. So particularly during this pandemic, some of you might be aware, some not, but there's a policy that is called Title 42. Title 42 basically started, as I mentioned, as they call it a health measure to prevent the spread of COVID-19. But what it is a policy that prevents asylum seekers to request this humanitarian protection before the government of the US. So anyone who approaches the port of entry currently is being rejected and sent immediately back. And here's what's going on. So we at Kino Border Initiative are receiving on a daily basis families that are arriving either from southern Mexico, from Central America, mainly from those regions. And most of them, it's until they arrive to us that they are learning that the border is currently closed and has been closed for the last year and a half. So once they arrive to us and we explain, there's currently not an open process to request asylum. Even the international and domestic laws of the United States state that any person who present themselves at a port of entry at US territory and request humanitarian protection should be, granted access to the asylum process. Not granted asylum, but access to the asylum process, at least for the claims to be heard. And what happens there is people has to make the decision what they're going to do, because most of them cannot return back to their home countries or to their hometowns, because they were given two choices, either to leave, or lose their lives. So when they leave, they cannot go back. And now that they learn that they cannot move forward, they have to make the decision of how to change their plan about, going to the United States. Are they staying in Nogales? Are they going to a different port of entry to see if the situation is different? So we have migrants waiting for months and months in Nogales for something to change. And we don't know how long it's going to take for them to be able to present their claims. We're trying to push things forward. We're trying to advocate for a change in these policies. The Biden administration promised to restore asylum, but so far they haven't delivered. And that's the big issue going on right now, this lack of access to asylum. And if a person or a family out of desperation tried to engage in a more dangerous path to get to the United States, such as crossing through the desert, jumping through the wall, or in regions like Texas that you have the Rio Grande, and they try to cross through the river, they risk their lives. And if they are encountered by Border Patrol, they will be immediately expelled under Title 42. So Title 42 is not about just preventing people from getting in, but it's also about expelling them immediately once they're already in. So they're currently not processing their cases or ordering the removal, but immediately expelling people without any process or hearing their asylum claims. And what I was saying, that it is an excuse more than the reason about the pandemic, is because we've been seeing policies from the US authorities try to deter or prevent or to kind of limit the access to the right to asylum even before the pandemic. So the pandemic for the US government was the perfect excuse, because before we used to have other policies such as Remain in Mexico, that you might have heard a lot about, these so-called migrant protection protocols. And I say so-called because they have nothing to do with protection in reality. And so you might be hearing of them because a federal court in Texas ordered the Biden administration to reinstate the program that the Biden administration ended as soon as they took office. And basically, this program or this protocol kind of sent people immediately back to Mexico So even if they weren't Mexican nationals, so anybody who would arrive through the southern border to the US, they'll be sent back to Mexico for them to wait for months to have their court hearings in the United States. So, the humanitarian organizations at the border documented a lot of abuses for the individuals that were waiting. And the other, I think the main issue is that, Mexico has a lot of asylum seekers by itself. So forcing people from other countries to wait in Mexico for a chance to present their claims is both inhumane and lacks of any sense. And even before that policy, we also have metering that was like trying to limit to a given number per port of entry the people who were allowed to present their asylum claims. So there's always been this intention to limit the access to asylum. And we as a humanitarian organization at the border, we keep pressuring decision makers to change these policies, to understand the repercussions in the lives of human beings in the other side of the border. And another reason why I was going back to Title 42, another reason why I was saying that the COVID-19 pandemic is just an excuse more than the reason is because recently there's been an announcement by the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of State about lifting the travel ban or the restrictions for non-essential travelers to come into the United States. So at the same time that they came up with Title 42 to limit access to asylum seekers, there was also Title 19. Title 19 was for people who weren't from the United States, so not US citizen or legal permanent residents. They weren't considered essential travelers. And if a person wanted to come into the United States by land, they weren't allowed to do so because of these restrictions. So they just announced that they are going to lift these restrictions for people who are fully vaccinated beginning November 8th. But it's not like they forgot about asylum seekers, but they intentionally and unnecessarily cross them off the list, and they are not allowing, even if they're fully vaccinated, asylum seekers to come forward with their asylum claims. So that's a few of the issues that we've been working. Of course, we also do some advocacy efforts on the Mexican side, trying to stress to the Mexican authorities that there's no human way to re-implement the Remain in Mexico policy, or trying to work with local authorities to overcome issues that prevent migrants from fully integrating into the society or the Nogales community. Because even if we acknowledge that most of the families that arrived in Nogales didn't consider Nogales as their destination, since there are no process to move forward and they're stuck in Nogales while they're here, they don't want to simply rely on handouts, but they want more like a hand up for them to be able to be able to integrate into the community. And we have identified some barriers in education, lack of access to education for the children of the migrants, or affordable housing. They are not able to rent a place, and they don't want to stay in shelters for months, or employment. And that's something really interesting to learn. According to the Mexican Constitution, any Mexican national is able to change of home within any state of Mexico. But what migrants from southern Mexico face when they arrive to Nogales, Sonora, is that they are not hired by local employers, because they are afraid that because they are migrants, they will invest this time and efforts in training them, and they will simply leave the job at the earliest opportunity that they have. So a lot of the times is finding temporary job opportunities, or helping them overcome these issues. And so it's very complicated, and a lot of the education efforts that we do is about helping people understand that there's no easy solutions for the immigration context. So like complicate things, understand that there's things that wouldn't be solved by building a wall, no matter how tall it is, and there's like no quick fix for it. And again, like stop seeing as an issue or stop seeing as something that needs to be contained, and rather work along with these lines. And for me, it's not only about the empathy of being a migrant myself, but it's a lot about like understanding what's right, what's wrong, and do it on a daily basis. So Saint Jose Maria Escrivá explained that Christians working in the world should not live like a kind of a double life. Like on one hand you have your interior life, and on the other hand, and a distinct life, your professional life or your social life or your family life. But it's more like how you work with bringing and finding Christ in others. So that is really something that resonates with me. Like, how do I'm able to find Christ in every single person that I encounter? And it's also about like being truly a bridge between God's mercy and the people that are trying to find it. So it's, I guess, like I always pray for myself, like not to become, an obstacle when they're trying to find God. So let me see if I can use the headphones. I think that there's some buffering going on, so this might actually help. Hold on a sec. This might be better. Hold on a second.
All right. So yeah. So if a person is trying to seek God and they find Pedro de Valasco, that's on me. I pray to God that they never happen. So I keep trying to be able to be a true bridge between the people who are trying to find God's mercy and God, basically. So there's no need for you to separate your interior life, your life of faith, and your professional life, but have it as an addition. And it's a good way to keep finding like a reason to keep doing this every day. And it might be frustrating at some point, like you're trying to do your best to advocate for a change in this inhumane policies, but understanding that small changes do make a ton of difference, that you're changing one conscious at the time, and like getting this understanding of the big picture, it's what helps you keep going and keep working, and touching one life at a time, and doing what's best because it's what is right.
All right, thank you, Pedro. I'm sure we will have some questions for you later, but for now, I'm going to pass it over to Sara.
Lovely. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm really excited to be here for a lot of different reasons. First of all, I'm excited because, as you mentioned, Jessica, I went to SLU, and so I came. SLU was kind of an important place for me, the journey that I'm going to speak about tonight, right, of trying to understand and ask these questions and grapple with, like, wait a minute, I thought I understood the world in this way, or I grew up learning from my Catholic family and context about the world in one way, and then by the time I got to SLU, I was like, what is happening, right? And so, in fact, it was during my time at SLU that I first volunteered at IFLA, and sort of came into this other perspective of how to approach these issues, and B, went to the border for the first time. And Pedro, I think you said something really eloquent that I wanted to lift up and something very simple, right, that I've tried to express before is like, once you sort of see the consequences of these policies and laws, it changes your whole perspective. And I think oftentimes I've come to spaces where I sort of say, like, there's nothing magical about why I have come to the conclusions or the understandings or asking the questions that I'm asking now. Because I actually think that most people who would have had the privileges and accesses and experiences that I've had probably would come to the same conclusions, right? But the challenge for someone who grew up in the Midwest is that we don't all have the opportunities and the privileges that I have enjoyed. So I think what I'm hoping to do tonight, some of you who are here tonight know that I would love nothing more than to get on a soapbox about laws and policies and how I think they need to be changed. But I'm going to shift that a little bit, at least in these comment and sort of the prepared remarks, and think about the questions that Dr. Lindsay proposed at the beginning, right? Of how do we take all of these pieces that I think in some ways, at least in my experience, I was taught to believe are separate, right? We do immigration over here and racism over here and justice over here and certainly churches over here. And if mass lasts longer than 45 minutes, 90% of the church is pissed, right? That's my experience, right? And that these are all separate. And especially I think these messages, these ideas come at us in a multitude of different ways, not just from our religious traditions, from our academic experiences, our professional experiences, but also from the government and the structures of capitalism and the systems that govern our lives, right? And so I think I want to maybe share some of what my experience has been like trying to make sense of that and share some of the questions that I'm still asking, right? I think this is a space to explore together why we're here trying to do the things that we're doing, and hopefully come out with some motivation, some clarification, and ideally, in my perspective, some new questions and some different questions to ask. So I'm going to start. Shoot, I said I was going to set a timer and I didn't do that. So let me just do that real quick. And I want to start just with a little introduction about IFLA. And so I'm going to pull this up and hope that the Zoom tech cooperates with me. Can someone maybe can you see a slide? Pedro, can you see that? Does that look normal? Great, thank you. I can see your face, so that's great. Thank you, thank you. So our organization has been around for actually next year we will celebrate 40 years in St. Louis. And we were founded out of this place of people from different faith traditions and perspectives of, understanding what's happening in, or maybe not understanding what's happening in Latin America, and then coming back and wrestling with, well, what's the responsibility, or some would say moral obligation, of people in the United States who are voting for and complicit in systems that are impacting communities that at that time we felt really separate from and really far away from. Clearly, those things have changed in the last 40 years, and I don't have to travel to Honduras to understand some sense of popular uprisings there and like what are things that are happening. I can very quickly rely on people who are much more skilled at Twitter than I am to tell me what are happening there and have access to that information in ways that we didn't used to have. We also certainly have seen drastic demographic shifts in the last 40 years, and that has changed a lot of not only how we do our work, but how the needs of the community have changed as well and how we respond to that. I think some of you also know that we are in an exciting place at IFLA where we have just begun or are just beginning a 3-year transition to expand our perspectives on these issues and look at how we start to build power statewide, how we start to really refocus on amplifying leadership from directly impacted communities and transferring power that some people who look like me and benefit from the systems who are designed to benefit me, how we rethink that, how we do that in a different way. I think the other piece that I want to briefly touch on about IFLA is some of our programming, and I know some folks here know and are volunteers in a lot of the programs, and the ways that we train volunteers to accompany different community members who have check-ins with immigration authorities, how we are working to build capacity in the region for the overwhelming demand for support for seeking asylum that Pedro mentions from a border perspective. We could also spend some time talking about that and questions maybe and what that looks like here and how that's changing recently. We are also have been involved in several other advocacy initiatives, right? And I think some people are familiar with our sanctuary work, maybe from the 80s and maybe from the last 4 or 5 years. And certainly with our work related to the Missouri Immigration Policy Coalition and looking at statewide, but also national laws and policies that impact lived experience. So I want to shift briefly into some of the ways I started asking questions, right? I started thinking about, well, here's all these messages that I was maybe grown up with or surrounded by, right? And I just want to own, these are really situated in my experience. I grew up in Eureka, which is West County. At one point, it was like rural West County. I would say now it's maybe less rural as things have changed. Pretty standard, I would say, middle-class, white, Catholic family. And I went to public schools. I was maybe the heathen in the Catholic world, right? Until I went to SLU and got my stars. But I think, right, we're sort of ingrained with a lot of these ideas of how our society works and how we're supposed to live. And I think we get those messages from, like I mentioned before, like from, in my case, like religion, and from schools, and from the way we're taught about US government, and the way we're taught about how government structures are supposed to work, and democratic ideals, and how the United States was created, and like this project. And, you know, we could even spend some time talking about how we talk about the colonists and the colonizers and why we use that language and all those things, right? So I think there were, you know, I was like present to all of those things. I was maybe aware of them less critically than I am now, certainly. But I think my challenges came when I started meeting people outside of that echo chamber of experience. And if I'm being really honest, it started when a Mexican restaurant opened in Eureka. And I hear myself saying those things, and I think there's a lot still that I'm unpacking about that. But to the extent that when you meet someone that is maybe at face value, someone that feels very different than you, and then in my case, like was speaking a different language and going to church in a way that looked drastically different. I was mind blown the first time I went to mass in Spanish, and like phones were going off and babies were crying, and the priest was like chuckling about kids who were like, there was no death stares. I was like, are we sure this is the Catholic Church, right? Like so different, but it sort of cracked open some opportunities to ask different questions. And I remember being a senior in high school in a straight A nerdy girl in the front classroom of like, how come no one taught me this? The family that I met and grew very close to at that time was a mixed status family. And I didn't understand what that meant. I didn't have language or knowledge to like understand what that meant. And when I started asking questions, it was like, God loves everyone and we're all created equal. And I was like, but that is bullshit, because it's not what we see. It's not actually what I'm living right now, because people aren't created equal. And if they were created equal, they sure aren't being treated that way right now. So like, what do I do with that? How do I make sense of that? And how do I like navigate through that, right? Let alone, what do I do with it? What's my role in that? What's my like purpose in life? Do I have skills that I can give to that? So those are some of the questions that I was asking. And fast forward to being at SLU and going to the border for the first time, which was in Nogales. And unfortunately, I left after my grad program the very year that Kino came to Nogales. And I was like, oh, that's great, I'm out. Like, so we just missed each other there, Pedro. But this was like another moment we could talk. We could definitely spend some time talking about how very like childhood religious stories in my experience, like the footprints in the sand story that I'm sure was framed on one of my aunt's walls, right, growing up. And then walking in the desert and like actually seeing someone's footprints in the sand and like having that moment for theological like reflection and like processing that is not something I would have in St. Louis, right? And then also certainly seeing very jarring images about like actual walls dividing people and what that meant. I think then as I started to get into, and I mentioned it briefly here, most of my time in Arizona was spent working for Humane Borders and on a master's degree, where I was fortunate enough to, unfortunately enough, to get close to the issue of migrant death and disappearance in the border. And it was in those experiences that I met Gracia's sister, who is Libya, who's in the striped shirt in the middle, and Gracia, who disappeared just a couple months before I moved to Arizona, and in fact, when she was 18 years old and 7 months pregnant, at the same time that my big sister was also pregnant. And so there were these other moments, right, where you're looking in these systems in ways that, you know, the consulates in the United States were saying, yes, we care, but no, that's not our jurisdiction. And governments in the United States were saying, yes, we care, but it's not our citizen. And at the end of the day, there's a family and a big sister in this case saying, I don't care whose system it is here. Like, this is my sister, this is my family. Like, how do we answer to that? And I think then those things, those sort of questions continue through different experiences. I had a chance to be in Kansas City doing work with immigrant communities, working on, at that time, Citizenship for Now, Citizenship for All, time is now, and working on deportation defense campaigns and learning again about how these things aren't by happenstance, right? The ways that we're seeing an increase in death in the border is not unrelated to the ways that we're seeing a fundamental, like an exponential increase in spending for interior enforcement and new contracts with local detention facilities. And even now, under an allegedly pro-immigrant, anti-criminalization of immigrant administration, we're seeing increased funding and increased surveillance of immigrant families and especially those seeking asylum. And so, you know, we could talk. I hopefully in the Q&A we have time to get into some of these issues. But like, as I continued to meet different people and learn from the wisdom of their experience, right, which was always and time and again sort of like eye-opening and earth-shattering and like challenging, right? It really offered moments to think about like, that's not how I was taught the world is supposed to be, but that's clearly how it is. So what do I do with that? And then I had the opportunity to meet Carly Garcia and her husband, Alex, and their family. And many of you know that in 2017, Alex moved into Christchurch here in Maplewood, where he lived in sanctuary for 3.5 years. And I think walking through this family's, like one family's experience, I think there's an opportunity to sort of get so focused in on something, and you might understand, you might be able to say, well, a law this way or a policy that way, maybe that makes sense. But then if you're able to look at the whole thing and say, okay, but maybe if it makes sense right there, does it still make sense here? Or does it make sense when you add this piece to it? Or does it make sense when you add this layer or this value system above it? Then how do we understand what to do with that? And so I think through the experience of bringing people together who are also wrestling with those questions, and also bringing allies together, bringing people like me who are never going to be in a position where I'm told that I don't matter, or where I have to question whether or not my access to citizenship is the only way that my dignity could be honored in this country, or if that even matters, right? Or some of those sorts of questions that I am not the only one asking. And I think part of what I have hoped to do and tried to do in the last couple of years is bring more people into that mess. And that doesn't mean I have the solutions or the answers, but I firmly believe that we have to be building relationships with each other so that we can enter into that mess, and so that we can ask those questions and be willing to totally F it up and then try again, right? I think too often we give ourselves a pass because it's too hard. And like, I'm not an immigration attorney, so how am I ever going to figure that out? That's a logic that gives us permission to ignore it. And that is permission that is like making us complicit in the ways that we maintain those systems. So if we're not comfortable with that, then it's not enough to just say like, well, that sucks. Someone else will fix that, right? But we have to grapple with that in our hearts. I think for me, the ways that I have always encountered immigration sort of as an issue, and with that certainly matters of race and privilege and supremacy, and the ways that that has even shaped my own life and my own experience, have not been separate, right? Those are always connected to me. And while I can certainly sort of give some analysis about laws and policies from a international law perspective, or from the way that I think laws should work in the United States, there's also a reflection about like my personal faith and my personal values, which I think are not necessarily uniquely mine, right? I think we share a lot of those values, but how do we then not just think about it and pray about it, but like embody that and live into that in all the messy ways that that is, and in a lot of realities, with a lot of risk that comes with doing that, right? It's not comfortable or always safe to ask challenging questions or to try to unpack biases, but I think that's what, in fact, we're what we are in need of doing. So I think for me, I will maybe end some remarks now with sort of what I would present as like a dignity first framework, which is something that for those of you that have been to IFLA programs, you've heard me talk about, right? And how do we, instead of shy away from let's separate, I go to church over here, or I pray over here, with I vote over here, and I go to school over here, and I work over here. What happens if we smash those things together, if we put those conversations at the same table instead of avoid them? Because that gives us an opportunity then to really say, well, I'm going to love this person. If we're actually called to love our neighbor, if we're going to accept some of these big mantras, then what do I do in this space? Because it's really easy to love your neighbor if you're not even willing to sit at a table with them, if you're not even willing to have a conversation, or to listen, right? And so if we're trying to actually do that, which for some people, I know that looks like building the kingdom or the kingdom of God on earth, or living into our calling or a divine, plan. I think we have lots of different frames and ways for understanding that. But if we are going to do that, then it takes an action, right? It takes something changing. And for me, I think fundamentally what sort of underpins my experiences and my ways of understanding and navigating these complex issues is a fundamental belief in transformation. I have to cling to this idea that we can create something different, that we're not just going to rearrange pieces, or that there's a finite way to do that, right? But rather that things could be fundamentally different, and we haven't gotten it yet. And so I think I will end there, and hopefully we can get into some conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. Genuinely, I was listening to that, and so many of those questions, I think, are questions that our students grapple with, and those of us who are faculty, staff, and engaged in this work are also still consistently trying to wrap our heads around and do better. With this, I guess I kind of want to throw it to you and Pedro to see, as I was listening and thinking about the work that IFLA does and the work that Kino does, I realized how much overlap there really is, not just population overlap, but the way your mission and your approach is. So as I saw your accompaniment slide and the way you were talking about religion and Catholicism, it just made me think so much about some of the experiences at the border with Kino. And so Pedro, I guess this is kind of to you, but don't feel pressure to answer. Just if you had any questions for Sara, or if you had any remarks that you're like, oh, when you talked about that, Kino also does this. If you don't have any of those, that's perfectly fine. I have other questions as well, but I thought kind of a time to let you respond to each other.
Yeah, so I guess like a lot of the things that were really resonating with me was when you were talking about like laws, like unjustful laws that and I was thinking and I myself I'm a lawyer, so from a lawyer's perspective I was thinking about like laws are tools of men to achieve and deliver justice. So when laws are preventing access to justice, they're not serving their purpose. So it's like whenever like you say like, yeah, I would love to help them, but the laws don't allow people to come into this country, or is it that's the issue, like that's when laws are not serving their purpose, that need to change. And I was also thinking about this love thy neighbor, that it's not only like it's like something you repeat yourself, but it's actually like an invitation to go out there and and that's the thing. I was thinking about this year's a message from Pope Francis from the World Day of Migrants and Refugees, and how he was telling us like to go out to the existential peripheries and welcome everyone. Like the Lord wants us to manifest his love and announce his salvation among migrants, refugees, displaced people, and victims of human trafficking. And I think like we get this idea about like a just bringing God's mercy to everybody, but sometimes we simply find ourselves in our commodities and like we don't want to go on and beyond. And that's the calling, that's something that we should be doing. And it's not about like sometimes we discuss this with people and say like, oh yeah, there's people who are poor in Africa. Yes, but there's also people who are poor right there in your neighborhood. And there's also, so they're not only migrants at the border, there are migrants struggling to integrate into your community out there, and as Sara was mentioning, about like, I'm recalling a lot of experience when I first arrived to the United States, and like some that might be like microaggressions, some might be just out of misconceptions about migrants, or these mentions about like you don't look like a Mexican, or things like that, or when you're asked to speak English at a given place, that like if I come across another person who speaks Spanish, I will be speaking Spanish. So a lot of this, when I was mentioning how we are engaging in these efforts to facilitate the integration of migrants into the society, like into Nogales, for example, like these issues such as security, employment, housing, education, access to health, these issues are also present with migrants in the inner United States. So that's something you can also address. And I guess like a lot of the times is this, if you're doing some advocacy or community organizing, you have to keep in mind that you're not doing things for them, but with them, that is about helping them develop leadership, finding their voice. So if you want to stay connected with why you're doing this, it's really important for you to actively listen. Otherwise you'll lose focus. Like for example, myself, if I'm doing these advocacy efforts without engaging in conversations with migrants, listening carefully to their testimonies, I would lose connection between what I'm doing and their needs. So if you want to keep it actual, you want to keep it, truthful to the cause, you have to carefully listen, and then you can decide, what is it, and I mean like as a collective decision. And it's sometimes about, most of the times is about bringing the information for them to make the decision. It's like the empowerment about decision making is really there. So I think that what Sara was mentioning, it definitely aligns with the efforts that we do here. Perhaps we have like not like the same goals, but perhaps like different specific actions that we are doing because we are here at the border and she's more here inside. But, you know, I think we're definitely in connection about the education portion towards the community and some advocacy efforts for the bigger picture.
Thank you, Pedro. And Sarah, I'm going to ask you a question too, but before I do that, two things. One, anyone in the audience, if you all have questions, please, please, please drop those in the question box. And then Rachel and Elizabeth may pop in as well and be asking some of those questions. But with that, Sarah, this is a little bit different, but kind of thinking about the difference between the work that you both do. So Pedro being on the border and you being here in St. Louis, can you talk a little bit more St. Louis specific as far as what you see as issues in St. Louis and in Missouri that need to improve?
How much time do I have? No, I'm just kidding. I think so. I think there are a lot of opportunities to rethink the way we're doing things, and I think I would maybe tie this into something that I heard Pedro talk about integration, and we've been asking questions about inclusion and what. How do we think about inclusion differently? And I think from specifically an equity lens, we all know that citizenship does not mean you're suddenly included in US society, right? And I think the flip side is that, is there a question like, can you actually be fully included in US society without citizenship? And so I think when you're asking about like St. Louis and what is going on here, that's the first thing that comes to mind, because there are a lot of ways that both locally and as a state, and certainly within the national context, that we are actively working to exclude, right? And that shouldn't come as a surprise, right? I think certainly if you're going to look at sort of broad trends in immigration law and policy in the United States, those have always been rooted in exclusion, in defining who doesn't belong here, which therefore defines who does, right? And so it functions both ways. So that's not lost on me. But I think the ways that we look at who is allowed or who is worthy of being here are questions that I wrestle with a lot, which are related to something that I heard about this idea of like, what is the purpose of law? And if law is supposed to serve certain values, if we're going to accept that, then certainly we would argue that those laws aren't always meeting those values. However, I think we can also explore that laws, in fact, are designed to serve values that I just don't like. And they're designed to serve predominantly white men that are sitting at the table making those laws, who are positioned and have historically been positioned to hoard that wealth and that power. And so I think we can complicate those narratives a little bit. So within that context, when I look at St. Louis, like what's going on here? I think, again, making some sweeping generalizations, we have like probably now safely 4 or 5 generations of immigrants. So that complicates things of recent, I would say, or I don't know, contemporary, and this is lots of things that we should define, but that are sort of recent immigrants that are now sort of establishing families here, but also then are opening or creating spaces for mixed status families. And we saw the impacts, we see how this functions in a lot of different ways, right? That means some people have access and some people don't. And there's a big spectrum of that. We saw it with respect to the to COVID relief funding and the IFLA funds that our organization worked with the Immigrant Service Providers Network to develop and sort of redistribute funds to specifically immigrant and mixed status families that were excluded. I think when we look at state level law, we have set some projects in motion that are in fact well served by the laws that continue to maintain who is allowed to be here and who isn't. And in fact, every year, for example, we have state legislators that try to amend existing law. Specifically, I'm thinking about laws that are designed to limit local control, which maybe could be in a big bucket of preemption laws, right? Of laws that we're going to pass things and say local governments can't make these decisions because we're going to make them for you. And so a local government who knows the community and is theoretically most in relationship with them couldn't set limitations on, can't set limitations on contracts with ICE, on access to ICE, access to local law enforcement, whether or not to honor the use of a detainer in terms of local police to ICE pipelines. And so the things that we might do to build power locally or reshape that locally, we can't do until we build it at the state level. And certainly that comes with a lot of challenges, being that we are in a supermajority state legislature currently. I think the last thing I would maybe say there is that we continue to see folks who are seeking asylum, and I want to speak maybe very briefly about asylum in Missouri because it sucks. And I just want to like maybe throw out some numbers here that the majority of people who are seeking asylum, so if we're going to look at the last year, there were approximately 2,400 removal cases that were filed from Missouri, which would include people that were processed at the border. So pausing for a moment to say that most asylum seekers today, upwards of like 80% of people who are seeking asylum as a defense to removal. And so it was a big key learning for me when like, oh, you come seeking asylum and you like go to a port of entry in the border and you're like, I want to seek asylum, and something happens there. This is my understanding. Something happens and you either get on a path to asylum or like in a process for it, or you get it. And that's wrong. So basically the majority of things that happen is that if you don't have some legal history that would prevent you from seeing a judge, then you have a right to see an immigration judge. And so the government's basically going to admit you so that we can deport you. And we're going to make a case against you. And then like, it's up to you to figure out that you're not in asylum proceedings yet, or that you're in removal proceedings, that you haven't formally sought asylum, that you have a limited time to do that, that you have to figure out how to get an attorney and file asylum. And if you navigate that whole gauntlet, you actually get in there, you're looking at a 3-year wait, roughly, in Missouri. And then you're looking at an 85% denial rate, which means the overwhelming, which is higher than national averages, right? So Missouri sucks. So like from a court level and from a state level. So I think, and the other issue there, right, to your point is that during that, you're also not given access, right? You can sometimes apply for work authorization, and those rules have changed recently, which are, again, we can talk about laws and policies, and these are not laws, these are policies and rules and regulations that are interpreting the intention behind the laws. So I'll maybe stop there.
Thank you so much. This is such a provocative and important conversation. I have a question that I think is directed at Sara and Pedro, and maybe even Jessica as well, which is maybe also sort of reflecting on the language that we've used to promote this, right? Immigration, justice, and religion, and how the category of immigration actually glosses over so many other legal categories, right? So asylum is something that you've all brought up as being something that is distinct legally from immigration, right? And is applied unequally to different populations who are seeking to claim it, right? So we've seen other crises affecting other populations recently as well. And I'm just wondering if you can give us some context into either historically or more recently, how asylum functions legally differently from other kinds of migration and movement and immigration. But then also, you know, who gets to meet that threshold? Who benefits from that?
I would love, if it's okay, I would love to, I think you highlight something that is maybe less about functionality of the INA and like how different access to this country is granted or not, but more about the narratives that have been crafted over and over again, and in fact are being regurgitated in front of our faces currently, that use different language to communicate, what I would say, communicate different values about those laws. So I think we talk about, and maybe I would certainly defer to Pedro's legal expertise in terms of the different ways that one can come to this country. But I think what has been very clear to me is that we have used all kinds of different language to create hierarchies of human value. And I don't actually think that there's another way to understand that. I think when we talk about immigrant and migrant, we say something different, right? And that I think when we talk about undocumented, that's different than other language that has been used to describe people in a similar situation. When we say asylum seeker and refugee, though we're communicating different things. And I think a lot of times we miss that. I think I remember reading about post 1986 reforms and into the early 90s that is what largely started the wave of prevention through deterrence policies that we continue to invest in and double and triple and down on today, is that you started to see a lot of maritime language. So, and I am not a communications or linguistics expert here in the room, but I remember reading about some things of like how we saw like floods and waves and droves to describe quantities of people. You can see the old cartoons from newspapers, right, that were used to literally paint pictures of how people, who people are and what their motivations and what their worth is, right? What it presents then is this idea of who should and shouldn't be here and how the rest of us are supposed to include or exclude and the degrees to which that happens. I think there's also an economic layer to that. I know that a lot of people love to talk about the economic impact of immigrants and why they're so beneficial to the United States, and therefore we should totally let them in because profit, right? And so like that's going to double down on other narratives that actually care very little about human value and human dignity and human worth, right? I think you could also see it in terms of where immigration law has sort of been housed, and how you've seen it move from Department of Labor to Department of Justice and now to Department of Homeland Security, and how those different frames have shaped the way we understand that. So I will maybe pause there.
Great. So I love what you were mentioning about, like these tags or like these descriptions, because, it's like, even if we are talking about, an immigrant, according to the law, it's a person who is a legal permanent resident and is on the way to become a citizen. And the rest of us that are not legal permanent residents nor US citizen, we're called non-immigrants. And it's not because, we're not intending to stay in the United States for a larger period of time. It's because the current immigration laws prevent us migrants from immigrating into the United States. So that's when you hear about like how the immigration system is broken, it's because it lacks of access for a person to legally come into the United States, for a person to legally arrive into the United States. And now you tag them as illegal or even like illegal aliens, which I hate the term, but like you're basically preventing people from legally coming into the United States, and now you're punishing them from this. So it's, for example, for a person to immigrate for family reasons, which is like number one category, you have to be an immediate relative. So either a spouse, a son, and you have to be under 21, because if you're above 21 or if you got married younger, then you're not an immediate relative any longer. Or you have to be the parent of a US citizen above the age of 21. And there are other economic reasons, like, it doesn't matter how much you make, like you have to prove that US citizen child of 21 years old is able to support their parents in order to immigrate. So it's really hard. And if we're talking about a brother, a sister, another relative, there's a wait time that it's crazy, particularly from some nationalities. So that's the racial component of it. If you're a Mexican national, you'll have to wait for 20 or some years. There's the table that I'm talking about. So for example, those categories that you're seeing there are the wait times for these groups. If you're from China, India, Mexico, or the Philippines, the waiting for you to immigrate through a not immediate family preference category, it's way longer. So you have F2A that it's current is the spouse or children of legal permanent resident. The F2B, it goes for brothers, sisters. So I don't want to get into too much detail, but basically it's about this wait time for relatives to immigrate into the United States. So it's not about like, you know, they were calling the anchor babies, or if you have a relative from the United States, then it's easy for you to immigrate. Then there's also job-related immigration. And that one is really hard for you to actually immigrate under a job opportunity in the US, because the job offers that exist, you have, so if you're not like the top of your field, like, you know, and I'm not talking about having a PhD, I'm talking about like you're Albert Einstein or some sort of genius, like top on your field. If you're not that, all the other categories job related, your employer has to show, you know, with a document from the Department of Labor that there is no other US citizen available to perform that same job, and that you are somehow not jeopardizing like the stability of the American citizen by hiring this forager into your business. So it's like at least a 6 month process, bureaucratic process that you have to go through in order to hire an immigrant and help him immigrate. The other ones that you've heard about job related are visas. So those are for non-immigrants. So they are allowed to temporarily come into the United States under these working visas, but it's for a short period of time. And sometimes they're like employer specific, or like for a specific duties, like for the agricultural workers that they come under an H-2A visa. So they're very, very tied into certain needs that the US government determines. And the third one is for humanitarian reasons. And that's where asylum falls. And, you know, currently the asylum process is closed, but again, there's some sort of exception. So basically I was mentioning that if, according to the law, a person should be able like to approach to the port of entry before Customs and Border Protection, to the officer at the port of entry, and express, you know, like, hey, I fear for my life. I'm running from threats, and, you know, I can't go back to my country of origin. And that person should be put in the asylum process, and that's the affirmative process. So what's happening right now is that if the person approaches to the port of entry, the officer there will say, and that's if they're lucky, because we also have the experience when they consider a threat of asylum seekers approaching and they immediately close the gate. So, well, that's another story. But basically, they're rejecting them on their Title 42 and not even listening to their claims and sending it immediately back. So if the person were to cross through the desert, you know, and let's say that they miraculously survive and they are apprehended, they will be immediately expelled on their Title 42 again. But here's what's tricky. If the person is not a Mexican national or a Central America, or for Central America, which I mean Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, if they're not from there, let's say that they're from Asia or from Brazil or a different country, then they make a exception. And those nationalities, they might process the asylum claim if they cross, you know, not through the port of entry. So what on immigration terms they call IWI, enter without inspection. Those are the only ones that are processing right now. All others, they are being immediately expelled. So again, it's like a discrimination based on nationality that it's happening right now. And before that, how the asylum process used to work was that they will, so asylum, even when it was operating, at a very low rate of success. So if a person has like a very high standard to demonstrate that they were actually fleeing violence or persecution, and, you know, that this was driven because of their nationality, the race, their membership to a certain group, etc., or political views, whatever. So if it wasn't that, and the government was not directly involved or anything, and they didn't meet the standard of the requirements, they would be sent back. And that's the thing, like most of the cases, like they say that out of 100, perhaps like 5 might succeed. And in that depends on the court, because you have courts that have like a 99% of denial rate. So that's very close. And again, that's the affirmative process. The other one is like, if you enter without inspection, or if you were apprehended inside of the United States and put in removal proceedings, then you can use asylum as a reason to stop your removal. So as kind of fight back your deportation, pointing out that you are afraid of being returned to their country. And that way the standard is even higher, and that you have to prove through a higher standard that you fear for your life if you were to be returned to your country. So again, like there's no easy process right now, and I can tell you, like not only from a lawyer's perspective, but from a migrant perspective, I am not a U.S. citizen nor a legal permanent resident because I can't. It's virtually impossible for me to be able to immigrate into this country because there's no access to it. There's no access. It's really close, really tightened for a migrant to legally immigrate in the United States.
Thank you so much for this important conversation. We have a question that came through from a participant in the webinar. Carlos comments that both Pedro and Sara noted the importance of centering the needs and the concerns of people who are directly impacted or staying truthful to the cause. And so Carlos asks, what are some of the most pressing and immediate needs and concerns at the border where Pedro is and also in St. Louis?
Thank you. So here at the border, the main focus right now is access to asylum. And what's preventing the access to asylum is Title 42. So our advocacy efforts are really focused on, urging the Biden administration to, fully restore access to asylum and to end this so-called health measure, Title 42. And so that's currently like our main focus, because, people have the right to asylum, they have the right for their claims to be heard, and it is really frustrating for them. And there's no easy explanation, because before they were saying like, okay, why is like trying to save your life not considered an essential reason for travel? But if a US citizen was going to Mexico on vacations, to the beach, or if a legal permanent resident was crossing to Nogales to have some carne asada tacos and then heading back to the United States, that was considered essential travel, and they had no restrictions. And now it's even worse, because non-essential travelers, and don't get me wrong, I do celebrate this, because I do understand that there are not only economic reasons, like people going shopping to the United States for Christmas, but also like families that overstayed a visa, or that they were separated because of these restrictions to travel in the border. But they unnecessary and unjustified leave out the asylum seekers when they amended these travel restrictions. So beginning November 8th, people with a visa that are fully vaccinated are going to be able to cross to the United States through the land ports. But asylum seekers, even if they are completely vaccinated, which interesting, most of the ones that we are, that are staying for months in Nogales, so migrants that are arriving to Nogales and they have been waiting there for months, they have had access to vaccination. So most of them are fully vaccinated. And it's not like, they have the proof of being fully vaccinated, and they have, the negative test for COVID, and they have, again, the proofs for their asylum claims. Even though they have this, they won't be allowed to present their asylum claim at the border. So it is really important to urge Biden administration to end Title 42. And at the same time, we've listened about, we've heard more and more how this court in Texas ruled that the Biden administration should reinstate Remain in Mexico, the so-called MPP. So it is also really important to stress out to the Biden administration the need for a rescission memo that ends MPP for good. And that is, so that those are like the two main focus. And again, they're not driven out of a political view or a political stand or anything like that, but about like the needs of the community we're serving in Nogales. We need to end Title 42 and the rescission memo to end MPP for good.
I'm very aware of the time, so I'm going to try to answer this very briefly, but I appreciate the question. I think I want to first name the national, federal level changes that definitely impact and are still urgent needs for community members here. People who have no access to adjust their status need a path to do that. And that has to come from Congress. Similarly, I would say folks who have DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, that has also been in a constant state of limbo. Congress fails to act on that. It is fully within their power and their authority, and they're choosing not to do it. And I'm going to use that language really intentionally. I would say hyper-focusing locally, we could talk a lot more about national stuff. We could talk about the budget. We could talk about refugee and refugee protections. Hyper-focusing locally, I would say one of the biggest needs is access to pro bono, low bono legal representation. We have two phenomenal law firms in St. Louis and phenomenal pro bono, low bono immigration law firms in St. Louis. Both could hire 10 attorneys tomorrow and have a full caseload the next day. And I think we are also missing, or many of us are trying very hard to ensure that our community is preparing for the longer term consequences that are coming from changes that we're seeing now, specifically as it relates to Afghanistan and what has flooded a lot of our news feeds since August about new arrivals, and not just folks newly arriving from Afghanistan, but from other parts of the world, and certainly the gross abuses against Black immigrants, both at the border and locally. So I think looking at things like surveillance, about the use of ankle monitors, about the use of technology, which is just a cash cow and a profit source for the U.S. government to monitor folks that don't need to be monitored. And that, in my opinion, serves certain values, but not ones that are my own. And I have to say, housing. People are really struggling to find quality housing, like basic needs and necessities. Even for people that have been here for a really long time. I have a ton of colleagues who are just scrambling to find where are people going to live, what happens when they get kicked out, what about jobs, work authorization, and the whole slew of things. So I think if we start at the root cause, I would look at intervention policies in Latin America, and then I would look at federal laws that are preventing people from being fully included.
Thank you. This is also important for us to be aware of. I have the privilege of asking the last question, and I'm mindful of the time, so I'll try to be brief, but I am asking this on behalf of my undergraduate Christian ethics class, where we have been wrestling with kind of what is the relationship between the church and the world, faith and politics, religion and secular issues. And we've looked at sort of all different periods of time and different responses that theologians and scholars have had to, how should the church be involved in the world? So, and some of my students really bristle at the idea of faith getting involved in politics. So I wondered if you could say a little something in just a couple minutes we have about the role of faith and religion in the work that your organization does. Is that, I assume it's mostly positive. Do you ever bump up against issues, dealing with faith and politics? Can you comment on that?
I can say very briefly that clearly we bump into issues. I am learning that not everyone understands my own faith the same way as I do. And so that leads to even some disagreements in the interpretation of, like, among people who are professing the same faith or religion. I think for me, where I try to focus is a conversation about values. And for some people that comes from a religious tradition. For some people that comes from text. For some people that comes from a multitude of places. For some people it comes from none of those things and from other experiences or other sources. So for me, I maybe would also be like, religion and government, I'm not sure, like, but values are at play. Values are motivating what's happening now anyway. And so I think we are doing ourselves a disservice if we're not naming what those values are, regardless of the source or the sort of motivating factor behind those values. They are at play. They are the interest behind the laws and the policies, and it's serving some. And so if we can name that, then we can have a conversation about that. There's a reason that we don't give a shit that people are dying and disappearing in our border in the last 30 years as a direct consequence to our policies. And we're choosing not to do anything about it and continuing, in fact, to invest in it. So, like, that's not by happenstance. And that's not like, we didn't know that was that's a value that is being clearly executed and maintained in those policies. And so until and unless we can name that, we're never going to be able to have a conversation about what actual values we want behind laws and policies. So from that perspective, that's exactly where I want to have that conversation, is what are your values? Where do they come from? How do they overlap? And what, in fact, do we want to inform, rather than sort of just like accept that that's what's happening?
And, a lot of the times, like, we are asked at Kino, or we've heard that, like, yeah, Kino does a great job, like perhaps despite of regardless they're like being a Catholic organization, but it's the only way, the other way around. Like, that's the reason what we succeed in the work that we're doing. That's the add-on. That's the difference between Kino and other organizations. Our Christian values that are at the core of why we're doing things. And so that's really important, a really important component, like, the faith-based motivation that we find into the causes. And like, whenever we come across like a discussion, it's like asking ourselves, like, ethically, what's best, like, or what's best for the community we are serving? What would be like the most just approach to this issue? And it's every single time, like, it's driven by our values, by our Christian values. So yeah, I think that it's, again, like, not separate, but always this perspective as a whole.
Awesome. Thank you both for the time tonight as a whole, but also for kind of looking at that really tough question and trying to figure out, what do we do with that? So to close up tonight, we do want to share a few events. So I know Sara has a few, or has one, I believe, maybe more. And then Pedro, if you have any, you are welcome to share. And then I will drop some flyers as well and information for everyone. But Sara, if you want to share about your event.
Absolutely. So I'm going to just pop a link in the chat real quick, but please join us on Monday. We'll be meeting outside of the ICE, outside of the building that houses ICE in downtown St. Louis at the corner of Spruce and Tucker at 5:30 for a vigil in collaboration with nationwide partners related to Day of the Dead, and calling out systemic oppression at the hands of that. And then last, I'm going to circle back to something Dr. Lindsay said right at the beginning about Live Religion in the Digital Age, who helped us last year create an online space to explore Day of the Dead, what it means, how it's celebrated in a multitude of different ways. So I just popped that link in the chat too. It's a really neat space, even as it currently exists, which is maybe a little bit unattended, but it's there, and I would invite you to take a look at that and certainly join us on Monday.
Awesome, thank you for that. Pedro, do you have any? Nope, you're good. Okay, wonderful. And then I dropped just like a little slideshow type thing in the link, but that has the information if you are interested in the spring break trip to Kino, in which we will be inviting Sara back again as well to speak at one of the prior meetings. So you hopefully will see both faces again if you decide to join. And then the other is the Mass at the Border that Dr. Lindsay is helping with as well. So please check those out, look at them, and sign up if you are interested. But with that, we are going to close up. Again, I want to thank Sara and Pedro for your time, as well as Dr. Lindsay and Dr. Block for being here and helping get everything together. It would not have been possible without all of you. So thank you tonight. And really, mostly thank you to Dr. Lindsay. She really put everything together, and it's through the lived religion that this is possible. So thank you all.